let's very briefly talk about one of the big objections to preterism, and that is it disagrees with what the early church fathers said. The early church fathers, everyone will tell you, weren't preterists. I think people would admit that they might have been partial preterists, some of them at least. They actually, the early church fathers, you can't really pin them down. They didn't all hold the same views. So, I don't know if this is Hank Hanegraaff or Dr. Phil, but he said, we can all be wrong, but we can't all be right. So, my point is, why do we care what the early church fathers said? And, okay, maybe you're like me. I guess I knew who the early church fathers were in general when you talked about them, but my friend, who I was talking to the other day, she doesn't know when you say the early church fathers, what do you mean by that? Are you talking about the apostles? No, that's not who they're talking about. They're talking about people that came after the canon, after the apostles finished the canon of Scripture. So that could be like Irenaeus or Eusebius or Polycarp or whoever. Some people, especially people that went to seminary, really, really, really love the early church fathers, and they hold them in such high esteem that it almost feels like, I don't want to say they worship them, but kind of feels like they can't do anything wrong or say anything wrong. And I'll tell you, that's one of the biggest objections to preterism. And I have a really simple refutation of that objection, and it is, why do we care what the early church fathers said? We have the words of Jesus, right? I have the words of Jesus. So why do I care what the early church fathers said if it doesn't agree with what Jesus said? And if you want to say we're misinterpreting what Jesus meant when he said it, okay, valid argument. But how are we going to figure out what Jesus said? They'll say, oh, you have to read the early church fathers that came after Jesus, and they will interpret for you what Jesus said. But let's think about that. They weren't Jewish. As far as I know, none of them were Hebrew. So I'm not sure what makes them better qualified to interpret Jesus' words than the apostles, who clearly interpreted Jesus to mean soon, nearly, quickly, shortly, at hand, and in this generation. You can read all their writings. If you doubt me, there's over 101 time statements in the New Testament. And then we have the Old Testament, which is, let's face it, what the apostles used to interpret Jesus' words, right? Jesus wasn't speaking a new language when he spoke to the apostles. He was just basically quoting from the Old Testament. So I think we would be better off to examine the Old Testament to decipher the meaning of Jesus' words. So my short answer, if somebody says to you, well, this disagrees with church history and the early church fathers, and I say, well, the early church fathers were wrong, because you can stand with them, but I'll stand with Jesus, I'll stand with Jesus. And let's be honest, people in Jesus's life were wrong. There's no perfect people. It's not like after Jesus suddenly everybody could perfectly interpret things and follow things, and they were flawed. I don't think the writings of the apostles were flawed. It's hard to claim that the Bible is inspired and claim that the apostles were wrong at the same time, or to claim that Jesus was wrong. This seems like a really, really easy answer to me. I cannot fathom how people place the writings of people that came hundreds of years after Jesus. Hundreds. And they place them above Jesus. They let them interpret Jesus. I mean, this is a no-brainer to me. I'm a simple person, you know. I'm a bear of very little brain. So I'll just stick with Jesus. You can have your church fathers. I'll just stand with Jesus.